Elizabeth Carter did not cry when her father was buried. She did not cry when the creditors came to the door. But on the night William Bennett stood in the middle of a crowded ballroom, laughed and called her his wife, as a joke she turned away so no one could see her face. Because for 7 years she had loved him in silence. And in that single moment, she realized silence had cost her everything. If you've ever loved someone who didn't know, stay with me. Subscribe. Follow this story to the very end and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The summer of 1817 sat heavy over Richmond, Virginia, the kind of heat that pressed down on a person's chest and refused to let go. The Hartwell estate blazed with candlelight. Carriages lined the long drive 3 deep. Inside the ballroom floor was crowded with the finest families in the county. Landowners, merchants, attorneys, and their wives all gathered for the Hartwell Midsummer Celebration, which everyone knew was less about celebrating and more about being seen. Elizabeth Carter stood near the east window with a glass of lemonade she had not touched. She wore her best dress, the pale blue one she had altered twice because the fabric had been her mother's. It was modest by the room's standards. Everything about Elizabeth Carter was modest by the room's standards. She was not the most beautiful woman present. She was not the youngest. She was not the wealthiest. But she had something that the room's glittering women rarely possessed. She was entirely, quietly, devastatingly real. She was watching William Bennett across the room. She always was. He stood near the center of the floor, taller than most men, broad-shouldered in his dark coat, laughing at something old Mr. Hartwell had said. William laughed easily. It was one of the first things she had noticed about him 7 years ago, when grief had settled over her father's house like a second winter, and William had appeared at the door with firewood and no explanation. He had simply said, "Your father was a good man. I reckon good men deserve to have their firewood stacked right." And then he had stacked it. And then he had stayed for supper. And somehow he had never really left. Elizabeth turned back to her window. She did not allow herself to watch too long. She had learned that rule the hard way. "Miss Carter." The voice came from her left, and she turned to find Mrs. Hartwell herself approaching Fan, moving like a small, agitated bird. The older woman's eyes were sharp and fond at once. "You are hiding again." "I am resting," Elizabeth said. "You are hiding. There is a difference, but not much of one." Mrs. Hartwell settled beside her with the comfortable authority of a woman who owned the room they stood in. "Mr. Bennett has been looking for you." Elizabeth said nothing. "3 times," Mrs. Hartwell added with the particular satisfaction of a woman who noticed everything. "He looked over here 3 times in the last quarter hour." "He is sociable," Elizabeth said. "He looks at everyone." Mrs. Hartwell sounded deeply unconvinced. "And I suppose you look at him the same way you look at everyone else." Elizabeth lifted her lemonade and took a careful sip. "I think the musicians are about to start again, Mrs. Hartwell." The older woman laughed and moved away, and Elizabeth exhaled slowly. She had become very good at breathing through things. It was not long after that when the trouble started, as trouble so often did at Richmond gatherings with Mrs. Alderton. Margaret Alderton was 52 years old, widowed twice, wealthy enough to say whatever she pleased, and pleased to say a great deal. She moved through the ballroom with her 2 daughters in tow, the elder of whom, Miss Constance Alderton, was 19 lovely, and had been positioned in William Bennett's orbit for the better part of 3 seasons. Everyone in Richmond knew it. The Alderton family had made no secret of their ambitions. And everyone in Richmond also privately acknowledged that William Bennett, who was 34, unmarried, and in possession of the largest landholding in the county, was well past the age at which a man of his standing ought to have chosen a wife. Mrs. Alderton crossed the floor with purpose. Elizabeth watched it happen from her window. She watched Mrs. Alderton approach William's group, watched Constance glide forward with practiced ease, watched the older woman maneuver the conversation with the skill of a woman who had been engineering social outcomes for 30 years. Even from across the room, Elizabeth could read the shape of it. The pointed questions, the meaningful looks, the gentle but unmistakable pressure. She turned back to her window. She did not need to watch. She knew how this would end. It always ended the same way. William would be pleasant. William would be kind. He would say something gracious and deflecting, and for another season, Mrs. Alderton would recalibrate and try again. Because William Bennet never committed, never chose. He protected everyone within reach and claimed no one for himself. Elizabeth set her lemonade glass on the sill. She was 36 years old. She was done pretending she did not understand what that meant. She was moving toward the side door, intending to take some air, intending nothing dramatic, intending only to breathe when she heard William's voice directly behind her. "Miss Carter." She stopped. His footsteps, his particular long-legged stride. She knew the sound of it the way she knew the sound of her own heartbeat, not because she had chosen to memorize it, but because some things simply lodge themselves inside a person, whether they ask them to or not. "I have been looking for you," he said. She turned. He was closer than she expected. He always was. William Bennet had a way of crossing a room that made it seem shorter than it was. He was looking at her with that expression she had never entirely learned to read, warm and certain, and with something underneath it that she had spent 7 years trying not to name. "Mrs. Hartwell told me," Elizabeth said. "Did she?" His mouth curved. "I reckon Mrs. Hartwell makes it her business to tell everybody everything." "She does," Elizabeth agreed. "She is very efficient." William glanced behind him, and Elizabeth followed his gaze. Mrs. Alderton was watching them from across the room. Constance stood at her mother's elbow, her expression carefully pleasant, and her eyes anything but. "Mrs. Alderton has been persistent this evening," Elizabeth said. "She has been persistent for 3 years," William said. He looked back at Elizabeth, and something flickered in his expression, something that might have been frustration, or resignation, or something else entirely. "I am about to be cornered again. I can feel it the way a man feels weather coming." Elizabeth almost smiled. "You could simply tell her you are not interested." "I have told her that." "You have been polite about it. There is a difference. Politeness is—" "William." His name came out before she could stop it. Not Miss Carter's quiet restraint. His name. Just his name. She recovered quickly. "Mr. Bennet, forgive me. I only meant she will not stop until you are direct." He looked at her for a moment. That look she couldn't name. Then he glanced over his shoulder again, and Elizabeth saw Mrs. Alderton beginning to move. What happened next happened fast. William turned back to Elizabeth, and without any apparent hesitation, without it seemed any particular thought at all, he offered her his arm and said loud enough for the nearest cluster of guests to hear, "There you are. I have been searching for you everywhere." And then, with the easy confidence of a man who had never in his life been accused of uncertainty, he added, "Forgive me, Mrs. Alderton. I believe my wife was waiting for me." The room heard it. Not every word the music had started again, but enough. Enough for the nearest faces to turn. Enough for a ripple of surprised delight to move through the guests within earshot. Enough for someone to laugh bright and social, the way people laughed at charming jokes in ballrooms. Because it was, of course, a joke. Everyone understood that. William Bennet was not married. Elizabeth Carter was not his wife. They were friends, old friends. The best of friends, people said in the particular tone that managed to suggest both fondness and mild exasperation. They had been friends for 7 years, and William Bennet had never, not once, not in any fashion that could be quoted at a supper table, indicated that he wished to change that arrangement. So it was a joke. Everyone laughed or smiled, and Mrs. Alderton recovered her composure with the speed of a woman well accustomed to social pivots. Elizabeth was on William's arm. She could feel the warmth of his hand through her sleeve. She was smiling. She had made sure of that in the first half-second before anyone could see her face change, and she kept the smile in place with everything she had. She was very good at that. She had been very good at that for a long time. She turned her face slightly away from the room, and in a voice barely above breath, a voice meant for no one, or for herself, or for some private place inside her chest, where she had kept this particular truth for 7 full years. She said, "I wish that were true." She felt him go still, not obviously, Not in a way the room would notice, but she was close enough to feel it, the slight arrest of breath, the almost imperceptible pause in the motion of his hand where it rested over hers on his arm. He had heard her. Elizabeth kept her smile. She lifted her chin slightly. She looked toward the far end of the ballroom as though she had not spoken at all. But the words were out. 7 years of silence broken by 3 words spoken to no one in a room full of people. And somehow they had landed exactly where they had no business landing. She felt him draw breath. She braced. "Lizzie," he said, low, different. "The Holloways are waving at you," she said. "Over by the punch table. Mrs. Holloway looks like she has something important to say." "Elizabeth, go." She lifted her hand from his arm with practiced ease, turned to face him with her best social expression firmly in place, and said, "I should find Mrs. Hartwell. I promised her I would look at her garden roses before the evening was out. They are apparently exceptional this year." She did not wait for him to respond. She walked away. She crossed the ballroom floor at a pace that was unhurried and entirely deliberate, spoke briefly to 2 women she knew near the door, paused to admire a painting she had seen 100 times before, and then with the calm of a person who had spent years making sure no one could ever read her face, she stepped through the side door into the night air. The garden was quiet. Cicadas. The distant sound of music through the walls. The thick, sweet press of honeysuckle that grew along the Hartwell fence every summer without fail. Elizabeth walked to the far end of the garden path, stopped, and stood very still. Her hands were not shaking. She would not allow her hands to shake. But her chest was doing something she had no category for. Something between grief and terror, and the peculiar vertiginous feeling of having said a true thing out loud for the first time after years of thinking it only in the dark. She had not meant for him to hear. She pressed both hands flat against the front of her dress and breathed. She had not meant for him to hear, and he had heard, and he had said her name, in that voice, that different low voice, and now she had no idea what came next. She had spent 7 years knowing exactly what came next. There was a comfort in that, even a sad one. But now the shape of the next thing had broken open, and she was standing in a garden in the dark with honeysuckle pressing against her, and no idea what she was supposed to do with herself. She heard the door, his footsteps on the stone path. She did not turn around. "You walked fast," William said. "I had somewhere to be." "The garden roses." "Yes." He stopped a few feet behind her. She could hear him breathing. She kept her back to him and stared at the dark line of the fence. "Elizabeth." Not a social voice. Not a ballroom voice. Something quieter and more careful than she had heard from him before. "What you said—" "I misspoke," she said. "I was caught off guard by the situation, and I—" "You didn't misspeak." Her jaw tightened. "William, I have known you for 7 years." His voice was steady, but there was something in it she couldn't account for. "I know the difference between a thing you misspeak and a thing you mean." She turned then. She faced him because she had too much pride to stand with her back to him while this happened. He was standing on the garden path with the house lights behind him, and his expression was not what she expected. She had expected discomfort. She had expected the particular gentle regret of a man about to handle a delicate situation with care. He did not look regretful. He looked, she had no word for it, struck maybe, like a man who had walked through a door he thought was a wall. "You have nothing to say to that," she said. Her voice came out level. She was proud of that. "That is all right, William. I have not said it before because I knew there was nothing to say to it. I should not have—" "I called you my wife," he said. She stopped. "I called you my wife, and you said you wished it were true." He took a step toward her. "I need you to understand what I am saying. I called you my wife, Lizzie. I did not choose someone else's name. I did not reach for any of the women in that room. I reached for you." The cicadas were very loud. "It was an expedient choice," Elizabeth said. "I was the nearest. You are never just the nearest anything. he said. "You have not been just the nearest anything since you were 29 years old, and you told me that grief does not follow a schedule, and I had just buried my mother, and I did not know a single other human being who would have said that to me." He stopped 2 feet in front of her. "You have never been the nearest, Lizzie. You have always been the one I walked toward." She could not speak. She had been preparing for this conversation for 7 years. Or rather, she had been preparing for the conversation that never came, the not quite this, the gentle deflection. And now that the real thing was in front of her, she had no speech for it. "You said nothing," she managed finally. "For 7 years, William, you said nothing." "I know. You let me—" She stopped, steadied herself. "I made my peace with what we were. I told myself I was content. I almost believed it." "I know." His voice was rough at the edges now. "I was afraid." "Of what?" He was quiet for a moment. The music drifted through the walls. Someone inside laughed bright and carrying. "Of losing what we had," he said. "If I said it and you didn't, if it changed things between us, I don't reckon I could have stood losing you as a friend, Lizzie. You are the steadiest person in my life. I was afraid that wanting more would cost me everything I already had. So instead you said nothing," she said. "And I spent 7 years interpreting your silences and trying not to hope and telling myself I was foolish." Her voice did not crack. She would not let it crack. "You protected yourself, William. You were kind to me in every way except the one that mattered." He flinched. She saw it, the small involuntary contraction around his eyes. Good. She needed him to feel it. "Yes," he said quietly. "You are right." She looked at him for a long moment. This man she had known in his grief and his laughter and his stubbornness and his particular way of going still when he was thinking hard about something. This man who had stacked firewood at her door and read books across from her by the fire, and once sat with her through an entire stormy night when she had been afraid without either of them ever mentioning that he had done it. She was so tired. She was so tired of carrying this quietly. "I need to go back inside," she said. "Lizzie, I am not angry, William." She drew a slow breath. "I am very tired, and I need some time before I can speak about this properly. Can you give me that?" He looked at her for a long moment. He looked like a man who wanted very much to say something else, and was choosing not to. "Yes," he said. "Of course. Thank you." She smoothed the front of her dress. She straightened her spine. She did what she had always done. She put herself together and prepared to walk back through the door. "Good evening, Mr. Bennet." She heard him say her name soft and helpless as she walked away. She did not stop. Inside the ballroom was warm and bright and full of people who had no idea that anything had happened. She accepted a fresh glass of lemonade from a passing tray. She smiled at Mrs. Hartwell. She admired the flowers near the mantel and listened to Mrs. Holloway describe at considerable length the virtues of her new cook. She stayed 2 more hours. She did not look at William once, but she felt him. That was the trouble with 7 years. A person got into your bones. She felt him the way she felt Weather not looking at it, just knowing it was there, knowing it was coming, knowing it would change the air. She had meant it, every word of it. I wish that were true. And now he knew. And the silence she had lived in for 7 years, the safe, contained, manageable silence was gone. When Elizabeth finally stepped into her carriage that night, when the Hartwell estate had grown small behind her and the summer dark pressed in around the windows, she allowed herself one moment. Just one. She pressed her fingers to her mouth and closed her eyes and felt the whole 7 years of it move through her, all the evenings, and the letters, and the careful smiles, and the practiced graceful acceptances of a situation that had never been what she wanted. Then she dropped her hand. She looked out the carriage window at the dark Virginia road. She had survived worse than this. She had buried her father. She had managed an estate alone. She had held herself together in rooms that expected her to be small, and she had remained large on the inside where no one could reach it. She would not fall apart over a man who had taken 7 years to hear what she said. But she would not wait another 7. That much she knew as the carriage rolled her home through the summer dark. Whatever came next, it would come on her terms, or it would not come at all. Elizabeth did not sleep that night. She lay in the dark of her bedroom and listened to the summer insects outside her window and stared at the ceiling and did not sleep. She had spent 7 years being sensible about William Bennett. 7 years of managing her own feelings with the quiet discipline of a woman who understood that wanting something too loudly only made the wanting worse. She had been so good at it. She had been, she thought, genuinely impressive in her restraint. And then 3 words had slipped out in a ballroom and undone all of it in a single breath. She turned onto her side. She was not going to think about his face when he heard her. She was not going to think about the way he had followed her into the garden, or the roughness that had come into his voice when he said her name, or the particular look he had worn, struck, she had thought, like a man walking through a door he thought was a wall. She was not going to think about any of that. She thought about all of it until the sky outside her window went gray, and then pale gold, and then she got up, dressed herself without waking her housekeeper, and went downstairs to make her own coffee, because there was nothing in the world that could not be marginally improved by having something hot to hold. She stood in her kitchen in the early morning quiet and held her cup and made a decision. She was going to be practical. She was going to be, as she had always been, the most sensible woman in any given room. What had happened at the Hartwell ball was a moment of weakness, a slip. 7 years of careful management and one unguarded second had cracked the wall she had built. That did not mean the wall had to come down entirely. It meant she needed to repair it and be more careful going forward. William would come to call. She knew that. He was not the kind of man who heard something like that and simply let it lie. He would come and she would be pleasant, and she would be composed, and she would find some graceful way to make it smaller than it was. She was very good at making things smaller than they were. She drank her coffee. She was almost convinced. He came 3 days later. She heard his horse on the drive from the front parlor, where she had been attempting to balance her household accounts with only partial success. She recognized the rhythm of it. She would have known the sound of that horse on gravel in a thunderstorm, and she set her pen down and folded her hands on the desk and reminded herself of everything she had decided. Practical, composed, smaller than it was. Her housekeeper, Martha, appeared in the doorway. Martha was 60 years old, had been with the Carter household since before Elizabeth was born, and possessed a gift for communicating entire volumes of opinion through the angle of her chin. Her chin was at a very particular angle now. "Mr. Bennett, miss," she said. "Thank you, Martha. Please show him into the sitting room." Martha's chin moved a fraction. "Sitting room," she repeated in the tone of a woman, noting for the record that the sitting room was not the parlor where they usually received William Bennett, who had been coming to this house for 7 years and had long since stopped being a formal guest. "Yes," Elizabeth said, "the sitting room." Martha's chin completed its editorial, and she went. Elizabeth took 30 seconds. She smoothed her dress, straightened her spine, and walked down the hall. William was standing near the window when she came in. He had not sat. He turned when he heard her, and she saw immediately that he had not slept particularly well either, which gave her a complicated feeling she chose not to examine. "Miss Carter," he said. She had not heard him call her that in years. He had called her Elizabeth or Lizzie since sometime in the first winter after her father died, when the formality had dropped so gradually between them that neither of them had marked the exact moment it went. "Mr. Bennett," she said. She sat. She indicated the chair across from her. "Please." He sat. He looked at her steadily the way he always did when he was working up to something, and she kept her expression pleasant and attentive, and gave him nothing. "You didn't answer my note," he said. "I have been occupied with the household accounts." "I sent 2 notes. I am aware." A pause. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees. "Lizzie, Elizabeth," she said, gently, firmly, like closing a door. Something moved across his face. He sat back. "Elizabeth," he said. Careful now the way a man was careful on uncertain ground. "I would like to continue the conversation we began in the garden. I'm not sure there is much left to say. I said a great deal, You said very little. I said what I said in the ballroom, she told him. That was sufficient. It wasn't. He stopped, rearranged. It wasn't sufficient for me. I told you things in that garden that I have not told anyone. I told you I was afraid, and I told you why, and I am asking you. Another pause. He was not a man who struggled for words as a rule, and watching him struggle now did something uncomfortable to her resolve. I am asking you to tell me whether any of what I said made any difference, or whether I am too late. The words sat in the room between them. Elizabeth looked at her hands in her lap. She looked at the pattern on the rug. She looked at him. You are not wrong, she said finally. About being afraid. I understand it. I do not fault you for being human, William. But understanding it and being unaffected by it are not the same thing. She kept her voice even. She was very proud of how even her voice was. I spent 7 years, William. 7 years of interpreting every small kindness and wondering and managing myself every time I thought I might say too much. That is exhausting. That is a particular kind of exhausting that I don't think you fully reckon with because you were not the one doing it. His jaw tightened. I know. I am not asking you to feel guilty. I am trying to tell you honestly why I can't simply hear what you said in the garden and pretend those 7 years did not happen. I'm not asking you to pretend anything. Then what are you asking? He met her eyes. I am asking you to give me the chance to do this right. The sitting room was very quiet. Outside, a mockingbird was making considerable noise in the old oak by the fence, but inside the quiet was the thick and consequential kind. Elizabeth stood. Not in anger. In the careful, deliberate way of a woman who needed to be on her feet in order to keep herself steady. I think, she said, that I need some time. How much time? The question was so blunt, it almost made her smile. Almost. I don't know, William. That is the honest answer. I don't know. He stood too. He was always doing that, rising when she rose, adjusting to her the automatic courtesy of a man who had spent 7 years learning her habits. It made her chest ache in a way she did not welcome. Will you not disappear on me? He said. While you're taking your time. Will you tell me you won't do that? I'm not planning to disappear. You didn't answer 2 of my notes. I was thinking. Lizzie? Her name, the old version of it, the one he had used for years, coming out of him before he could stop it. I can bear the time. I can be patient. I just need to know you haven't, that I haven't already lost you. She looked at him for a long moment. No, she said quietly. You haven't lost me, but you don't have me either, William. Not yet. He nodded once. The nod of a man accepting terms he had not negotiated but understood were fair. I'll go, he said. But I'm coming back. I reckon you will, she said. He went. She stood in the middle of the sitting room and listened to his horse leave the drive, and she allowed herself exactly 1 minute of not being composed before she pressed her knuckles to her sternum, breathed through it, and went back to her household accounts. The numbers still did not add up. Nothing apparently did. The weeks that followed were the strangest of Elizabeth Carter's adult life. William kept his word. He did not push. He did not appear uninvited or send daily notes or create any of the dramatic pressure she had half expected and half feared from a man who had finally decided to say what he meant. Instead, he came when he had reason to come, when there were matters that touched both their households, when mutual friends created occasions, and he was exactly what he had always been to her. Attentive, steady, funny in his dry, unhurried way. He treated her with the same careful respect he always had, except that now underneath it there was something else. A watchfulness, a quality of attention that was new, or perhaps not new, perhaps simply no longer hidden. She noticed. Of course she noticed. She had been cataloging every small thing about this man for 7 years. She noticed the way his eyes found her first when he walked into a room. She noticed that he angled himself toward her in group conversations without appearing to do it deliberately. She noticed that when someone said something cruel, even something carelessly socially cruel, the kind of thoughtless remark that Richmond society produced with the regularity of a mill wheel. He was always the one who quietly rerouted the conversation. He had always done that. She had simply allowed herself to look at it directly now, instead of sideways, instead of through the managed distance she had maintained for so long. It was not making her decision easier. It was Martha who told her about Charles Whitmore. It was a Tuesday morning in late July, and Martha came in from the market with her basket and her news and her chin at an angle that meant something significant was incoming. "There's a man in town," Martha said, setting her basket on the kitchen table, with the deliberateness of someone building up to a larger point. "Came up from Charleston 3 weeks ago. Whitmore. Charles Whitmore. Merchant, they say. Set up at the Rowan boarding house. Very well dressed for a man staying at a boarding house." Elizabeth looked up from the bread she had been slicing. And Mrs. Hale says he was asking about you." Martha's chin assumed its most authoritative angle. "Specifically, by name." Elizabeth put the bread knife down. "Mrs. Hale says he was very interested in the Carter property," Martha continued. "Who holds the deed, how the late Mr. Carter disposed of his affairs, whether the estate is managed by a male trustee or—" Martha's mouth thinned slightly. "Or whether the daughter manages it herself." Elizabeth was quiet for a moment. He asked those things at the market. He asked Mrs. Hale at her sister's dinner table. Mrs. Hale was there because she helps with the cooking on Thursdays. She said he was very charming about it. Very casual, like a man just making conversation. Martha looked at her. He was not just making conversation. "No," Elizabeth agreed slowly. "I don't reckon he was." She met Charles Whitmore for the first time 4 days later at the Holloway's afternoon gathering, the kind of Richmond occasion that happened because it was summer and people needed somewhere to be, and Mrs. Holloway was always willing to provide the somewhere. He was, she granted, exactly as well-dressed as Martha had said. Tall, well-built, somewhere around 40, with a broad, easy smile, and the kind of manner that suggested he had spent considerable time making rooms feel comfortable around him. He was introduced to her by young Mr. Holloway, who seemed genuinely delighted with his new acquaintance, and he turned to her with that smile and said, "Miss Carter, I have been hoping to meet you." "Is that so?" she said pleasantly. "Your father's reputation as a legal mind preceded itself even in Charleston," he said. "I had the occasion to consult his published opinions twice. He was exceptionally clear in his reasoning. It was exactly the right thing to say." She knew it was exactly the right thing to say, which meant he had known it too, which meant he had prepared it. But she was also, despite herself, genuinely moved by the mention of her father. Praise for her father's mind had always reached her in a particular place. "He was," she said. "Thank you." "I understand you manage the estate yourself," Whitmore said. "Conversational. Easy. Like a man merely filling time. That is remarkable for a woman," she said. He smiled. "I was going to say, for anyone managing an estate of that complexity without formal legal training. I meant it as a compliment, Miss Carter." She studied him for a moment. "Did you?" "I did." The smile remained, but something behind it sharpened very slightly, an adjustment, she thought a recalibration. He was assessing her the same way she was assessing him, and they both knew it, and he knew that she knew it, and he found that interesting. She could see that he found it interesting. "I wonder if I might call on you sometime this week. I have some business questions that your perspective might help clarify." "Business questions," she repeated, "regarding property specifically, matters of local deed law and inheritance. I have interests in Virginia, and I find myself needing guidance." She looked at him for another moment. Then she said, "You may call on Thursday, Mr. Whitmore, at 2 o'clock. "I am grateful, Miss Carter." She smiled at him and moved away to speak to Mrs. Holloway, and she did not allow herself to think about it too hard until she was back in her carriage. Then she thought about it very hard indeed. He wanted something. She was not certain exactly what, but she was entirely certain that a wealthy merchant from Charleston did not travel to Richmond and begin inquiring about the management of a modest estate out of mere intellectual curiosity. Whatever Charles Whitmore wanted, it involved her father's property, which meant it was something she needed to understand before he had the opportunity to arrange it without her. She thought about telling William. The thought arrived, and she put it aside. She was not going to William Bennett every time something complicated appeared on her horizon. She was not that kind of woman. She had managed complications before. She could manage this one. She was almost entirely sure of that. Charles Whitmore arrived on Thursday at precisely 2 o'clock, which told her something about him. A man who arrived exactly on time had calibrated his arrival. He had thought about the impression punctuality would make. He seated himself across from her in the sitting room, the same chair William had sat in, which struck her as somehow pointed, and he smiled, and he was charming, and he asked his questions about local property law in a way that was genuinely knowledgeable. And she answered them carefully, and somewhere in the middle of the conversation, she realized that he was very, very good at this. He was good at making a conversation feel friendly when it was actually a transaction. He was good at asking questions that gathered information while appearing to simply be curious. He was good at looking at a woman in a way that suggested she was remarkable, interesting, worth his particular attention, without ever saying anything that could be quoted back to him as inappropriate. "You are an unusual woman, Miss Carter," he said near the end of the hour. "Most women in your position would have engaged a male trustee by now. Most women in my position have the option of engaging a male trustee without worrying that the trustee will take a more active interest in the property than they were engaged to provide," she said. He blinked, just once. A very small blink. Then the smile came back, and this time it was slightly different, more real, she thought, less performed. "That is a remarkably clear-eyed observation." "I find clear eyes are useful when men are talking about my property." He laughed. It sounded genuine. "I think I may have underestimated you, Miss Carter." "Most people do, Mr. Whitmore," she said. "I find that useful too." He left at 3 o'clock. He asked if he might call again. She said she would consider it. She sat in the sitting room after he had gone and thought about what had just happened. She was not afraid of Charles Whitmore, but she was careful around things she did not yet understand. And she did not yet understand what he wanted specifically enough to know whether careful was sufficient. She was still sitting there when Martha appeared. "Well," Martha said without preamble. "He's intelligent," Elizabeth said, "and practiced." "Practiced," Martha repeated. The word came out flat and pointed. "He knows how to make a woman feel seen without making any promises," Elizabeth said. "It is a skill. He has worked on it." Martha's chin moved to its highest and most severe angle. "Should I start locking the front gate at night?" "Not yet," Elizabeth said, "but don't leave it on the latch." The next time she saw William was at the Richmond Ladies' Society summer luncheon, which William attended only because his aunt was on the organizing committee, and she had requested his presence with the particular firmness of a woman who did not actually make requests. Elizabeth arrived late. Her horse had thrown a shoe on the drive-in, and when she walked in, William was already seated beside his aunt at the long table. He looked up when she entered. She saw him see her, and then immediately after saw him see something else. Something behind her. She turned. Charles Whitmore was there. He had not been on her list of expected guests. He was escorting Mrs. Holloway's niece, a pleasant girl of 20, who looked mildly bewildered by the occasion, and he was smiling his careful, practiced smile, and when he saw Elizabeth, the smile shifted into the slightly realer version she had glimpsed in the sitting room. "Miss Carter," he said, approaching immediately. "What a pleasant surprise." "Mr. Whitmore." She was aware of William's eyes on her back. "I didn't know you were acquainted with Miss Rowe." "We met at the Holloways last week. She was kind enough to allow me to escort her today." He glanced around the room in a way that was perfectly casual and suggested he had immediately assessed everyone in it. "This is a fine gathering." "It is," she agreed. "Will you excuse me? I should find my seat." She found it. She did not look at William as she settled into her chair across the table, but she could feel the quality of his attention shifting the particular focused stillness of a man who had just noticed something he did not care for. He waited until after the luncheon. He waited, which was unlike him. William Bennett was not generally a man who waited when he had something to say, and she knew the waiting was deliberate, that he had decided to wait, and she was not sure if she appreciated that or found it more worrying. He fell into step beside her as she moved toward the door. "Whitmore," he said, not a question. "He has called twice," she said. "A beat. You didn't mention it. It hasn't been your business to mention too?" His jaw tightened. He did not dispute it, which meant he knew she was right, which meant something. "Do you know him well?" "Well enough to be cautious," she said, "which is my general approach to people I have recently met." "Where is he from?" "Charleston." "And what does he want in Richmond?" She stopped walking. She turned to face him. He was watching her with that careful, focused attention, and she met it directly because she was not going to be managed right now, not even by a man she had loved in silence for 7 years. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "I am working on finding out." "Let me—" "No," she said, simply, clearly, without heat. "William, no, I will handle this." He looked at her for a long moment. The muscle in his jaw moved once. "You'll tell me if you need something." It was not quite a question, not quite an order. Something in between, delivered in the voice of a man who was trying very hard to respect a boundary he did not want to respect. "Yes," she said. "I will tell you if I need something." It was only later, walking to her carriage, that she realized that was the first time in 7 years that she had kept something from him. The first time she had deliberately drawn a line between his concern and her private business. It should have felt strong. It felt lonely as a field in winter. But she kept walking, because loneliness she knew how to carry. It was the other thing, the warm, dangerous other thing that lived in the space between William's careful silences and his not-quite questions, that she had not yet learned to hold without losing herself inside it. Charles Whitmore called a third time, and a fourth. Each visit was pleasant, measured just slightly more personal than the last. He asked her opinions. He remembered things she had said. He brought on his fourth visit a volume of her father's published legal opinions that he had apparently tracked down in Charleston, saying only that he thought she might like to have it. She did like to have it. That was the problem. He was very, very good at finding the things a person liked. "He brought your father's book," Martha said later in the flat voice of a woman delivering evidence to a judge. "Yes. That is not the behavior of a man who wants to talk about property law." "No," Elizabeth said. "It is the behavior of a man who did his research." "And you're letting him call?" "I am keeping him where I can see him," Elizabeth said. "That is different from letting him." Martha looked at her for a long time. "Is it?" Elizabeth had no answer for that. Which was, she thought, itself an answer. It was William who brought her the first real piece of what she needed to know. He arrived on a Wednesday morning without a note, which he had not done since before the Hartwell ball. She was in the back garden with her pruning shears when Martha came to find her, and she went inside and found him standing in the front hallway with his hat in his hands, and an expression she did not immediately have a name for. "Sit down," she said, because he looked like a man who needed to sit. "I'm fine standing," he said, which meant something was wrong. She sat. She looked at him. "I have a friend in Charleston," he said, "a business associate. I wrote to him last week." She went still. "About Charles Whitmore," she said. "Yes." He met her eyes squarely. No apology. No evasion. "I wrote to him about Charles Whitmore." She looked at him for a moment. The part of her that wanted to be angry at the interference wrestled with the part of her that had been quietly worried for 3 weeks and was desperate for information. The worried part won. "What did he find?" William pulled a letter from his coat, set it on the table beside her. "Whitmore is not primarily a merchant. Or rather, he is, but that is not his primary occupation." A pause, and his voice was very even and very deliberate, in the way of a man choosing his words with care. "He has over the past 6 years married twice. Both women were widows or sole heirs managing inherited estates. Both marriages ended with Whitmore in legal control of the property. Elizabeth looked at the letter. One woman died within 2 years of the marriage, William continued. The other, the second wife, divorced him last year after discovering that he had transferred the primary deed of her estate into a business holding that excluded her by name. The room was very quiet. "He looked up my father's estate records," Elizabeth said. "Before he came to Richmond." "Yes." "He knew what I manage and what I hold." "Yes." She picked up the letter. She read it. She set it down. She sat for a moment with her hands flat on the table and looked at the pattern in the wood grain and thought about Charles Whitmore's practiced smile and her father's book and the way he always managed to find exactly the right thing to say. "The person who is most dangerous," she said, "is not the one who tells the biggest lies. It is the one who tells you exactly what you most wanted to hear." William said nothing. He just watched her. She looked up. "You should have told me you were writing to Charleston." "Yes," he said. "I should have." "You should have asked first." "I know." "But you did it anyway." "Yes." He didn't look away. "I did it anyway because I was worried about you, and I'm sorry for doing it without asking, but I am not sorry for doing it. You can be angry with me for that." She looked at him for a long moment. This man, this infuriating, careful, complicated man, who had been late in every way that mattered and early in every way she didn't expect. "I'm not angry," she said. Then more quietly, "I'm grateful." Something moved across his face. Something she was finally, after 7 years, beginning to let herself look at directly. "What will you do?" he asked. She straightened. She squared her shoulders. She thought about her father's book sitting on her parlor shelf, placed there by a man who had researched what she needed and used it like a key. "I am going to finish what he started," she said. "I am going to let him think it is working. And while he thinks that I am going to find out everything there is to find." William looked at her with an expression she now had a word for. It was not just admiration. It was the look of a man who had known a woman for 7 years and was only just now reckoning with how much of her he had been too afraid to see. "Don't face him alone," he said. "I won't," she said. And for the first time since the night in the Hartwell garden, she meant it entirely. She did not tell him everything. That was the first thing Elizabeth decided walking back through her front hallway after William had gone. She had said she would not face Whitmore alone, and she meant it, but meaning it and surrendering control of the situation were two entirely different things, and she was not prepared to surrender control of anything. Not yet. Not when she was only just beginning to understand the shape of what Whitmore wanted. She went to her father's study. It was the one room in the house she had not changed since his death. His books still lined the walls in the order he had arranged them. His desk still sat at the same angle to the window because he had always said the light fell better that way in the mornings. She kept the room clean, and she kept the lamp trimmed, and she came here sometimes when she needed to think, because thinking in her father's study had always felt like thinking with better equipment. She sat down at his desk. She opened the top drawer and took out the household ledger, not the one she kept for daily accounts, but the older one, the one her father had maintained, and that she had continued after his death. 6 years of property records, deed payments, tax filings, the quarterly assessments that her father's attorney, old Mr. Graves, had helped her navigate in the first year before she had understood enough to navigate them herself. She turned to the most recent entries. The Carter property was not enormous. It was not the Bennett landholding which stretched across more acreage than most men in Virginia would see in a lifetime. But it was solid, and it was clear, and it sat on a particular ridge above the river that her father had once told her would be worth twice its current value within a generation because of the water rights that came with it. He had said it matter-of-factly, the way he said most things, not as a boast, but as a legal observation. Her father had been very good at seeing what land would become before other people noticed. Whitmore had read his published opinions. Whitmore had come from Charleston and asked about the Carter estate, and arrived with her father's book in his hands, like a man who had done his reading. Elizabeth traced her finger down the ledger entry for the water rights survey her father had commissioned 12 years ago. The survey that sat in the county record office in a file that was technically public knowledge but practically invisible to anyone who didn't know specifically to look for it. She closed the ledger. She needed to know what Whitmore knew, specifically. Not generally, not the broad outline that William's Charleston contact had provided, useful as that was. She needed to know what documents he had accessed, what he had read, and how far his planning had already progressed. Which meant she was going to have to let him keep coming. She was going to have to let him think he was winning. It was not a comfortable thing to decide. Elizabeth Carter had not survived 6 years of managing her estate alone in a county where every second man assumed she would eventually make an error significant enough to justify his intervention by being comfortable. She had survived by being clear-eyed and patient, and occasionally ruthless in the precise, quiet way that people rarely noticed until it was too late. She straightened the ledger on the desk. She could be patient. She could be very, very patient. Charles Whitmore arrived the following Tuesday with 2 things: a proposal to discuss a joint business arrangement involving river transport, and a smile that had been calibrated so carefully that Elizabeth suspected he had practiced it. She listened to the proposal with genuine attention. It was not a bad proposal on its surface. River transport was profitable. The stretch of water in question was well positioned, and the framing was reasonable enough that a less suspicious woman might have found it attractive. That was, she noted to herself, precisely the point. A bad proposal would have told her nothing about him. A good proposal, one that was almost entirely legitimate, except for the piece he hadn't mentioned yet, told her a great deal. And the entry point for the arrangement? She asked when he had finished. In practical terms, what would I be contributing? The water rights, he said, smoothly, easily, like a man mentioning the weather. The Carter survey from 1805, I believe it was. Your father was very thorough. Those rights anchor the entire arrangement. There it was. She kept her face entirely pleasant. And in exchange, a percentage of the transport profit, quarterly. The terms would be formalized through a deed amendment that our attorneys would draft. He spread his hands in the gesture of a man offering something generous. It's a straightforward arrangement, Miss Carter. You contribute an asset that is currently dormant, and it begins producing income. It is currently dormant, she said, because I have not yet decided what to do with it. There is a difference between dormant and available. He smiled, the practiced version. Of course, I raise it only as a possibility. I appreciate the possibility, Mr. Whitmore. I will need to consult my attorney before any arrangement of this nature. Naturally. He was unruffled. There is no urgency. There is for you, she thought. She could feel it, the slight increase in focus behind his ease. The way he had steered the conversation to the water rights within 20 minutes, when on his previous visits, he had taken longer to approach what he wanted. He was moving faster. Which meant something had changed, or was about to change, or he had a timeline she didn't yet know about. She filed that away and offered him more coffee. After he left, she sat for 5 minutes exactly, and then she went to find Martha. I need you to go to the county office tomorrow morning, she said. I need you to ask Mr. Fenwick, the clerk, the younger one who helped us with the tax filing last spring. I need you to ask him whether anyone has recently requested to view the Carter property records. Martha looked at her. Is that something a clerk will tell me? Mr. Fenwick will tell you, Elizabeth said. He has been trying to court your niece for 2 years, and he is very anxious to be thought helpful by this household. Martha's chin moved through several positions. That is a ruthless use of my niece's social situation. I will send her a very nice length of fabric as an apology, Elizabeth said. Will you go? Martha went. She came back the next afternoon with the information that, yes, a man matching Whitmore's description had visited the county record office twice in the past month. He had specifically requested the water rights survey, the original deed of purchase, and here, Martha's voice dropped slightly, the way it did when she was conveying something she considered alarming, the probate records from the late Mr. Carter's estate settlement. Elizabeth sat with that for a moment. The probate records. He was looking at what her father had left, how it had been distributed, and whether there were any gaps in the legal chain of possession. He was looking for weaknesses, for a place where a well-drafted deed amendment might slide in without disruption, or where a joint arrangement might gradually, through the careful accumulation of legally documented interests, transfer control of something she held to someone who held it alongside her, and then eventually instead of her. She was not afraid. She was angry. The anger came up clean and cold and clarifying the way good anger did, and she let it come, and then she set it aside because anger was useful only when she controlled it and not when it controlled her. "He is thorough," she told Martha. "He is crooked," Martha said. "Both things can be true." She stood. "I need to write some letters." The first letter went to William. It was brief. It said, "I need the name of your attorney in Charleston. Not for a legal matter yet. For a question. I'll explain when I see you." The second letter went to old Mr. Graves, her father's attorney who was retired now, but who she knew still kept his files and his mind in excellent order. She asked him to come to the house at his earliest convenience on a matter of some confidentiality. The third letter she did not send. She wrote it and read it back, and then held it over the candle flame and watched it burn, because it was the letter she had needed to write, but not the letter anyone needed to receive. It was in some ways a letter to her father, telling him what was happening, and asking him what she should do. She burned it, because she was a practical woman, and practical women did not send letters to the dead. But she felt better for having written it in the way that sometimes doing a useless thing still served a useful purpose. Mr. Graves arrived Thursday. He was 81 years old, walked with 2 canes, and possessed a mind like a steel trap that had not rusted in the slightest, despite 4 decades of disuse. He sat across from Elizabeth in her father's study and listened to everything she told him without interruption, which was how she knew he was taking it seriously. Mr. Graves interrupted when he was half listening. When he was fully listening, he was entirely still. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The water rights survey," he said. "Yes." "Your father and I spent 3 months on that survey," he said. "The documentation is airtight. I wrote the filing myself." "I know. But—" He tapped one cane against the floor once. "There is a clause in the deed of purchase, your grandfather's original deed, 1778, that allows for co-management of riparian rights under a joint commercial agreement. It was standard language at the time. Your father knew about it and considered it immaterial because he had no intention of ever entering such an agreement." Elizabeth looked at him. "And if someone drafted an agreement that met the clause requirements, they would have a legal basis to claim co-management rights," Graves said. "Not ownership, not transfer of title, but co-management, which in practice means they control what happens to the property without holding the deed." Elizabeth said, "Yes." He looked at her steadily. "Your father was aware of the clause. He chose not to amend it because the process was expensive, and he believed no one was likely to invoke it without his knowledge." A pause. "He did not anticipate that you would be managing the estate without him when someone tried." The words landed quietly. No accusation in them. Only the plain truth of a thing she had thought herself in the darker hours of the past several years. "What do I need to do?" she asked. "You need to formally amend the original deed to close the co-management clause," Graves said. "It will require filing with the county court. It will take approximately 6 weeks, and it will be on public record, which means if Whitmore is monitoring the records, which he is, he will see it the moment it is filed," Elizabeth said. "Yes. And if he moves before I can complete the filing?" Graves looked at her over his spectacles. "He would need you to sign something, a joint agreement of some kind. He cannot invoke the clause unilaterally. He needs your signature on a document that qualifies as a commercial agreement under the original deed language." "He is already proposing one," Elizabeth said. "A transport arrangement. He presented it this week." Graves was quiet for a moment. "How close were you to signing it?" "I was never close," she said. "But he doesn't know that. The old man looked at her for a long time. Then something moved across his face, that she recognized the particular expression he had worn when she was 12 years old and had correctly parsed a legal argument her father had set her as a puzzle. A kind of surprised satisfaction. "Your father would be very proud of you," he said. She held that for a moment. Set it somewhere careful. "What do I do next?" she asked. "You begin the amendment filing immediately," he said. "And you do nothing that looks like hesitation or withdrawal to Mr. Whitmore. If he believes you are proceeding normally, he will not accelerate his timeline. And if he does accelerate, then you bring what you know to the county court, and you let the law do what the law is built to do," Graves said. "Your father's documentation is meticulous. It will hold." She nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Graves." "Don't thank me yet," he said, reaching for his canes. "File the paperwork first." She filed it the next morning. She told William that evening. He had come over under the pretext of returning a book she had lent him 4 months ago, which neither of them acknowledged as a pretext. He sat in the front parlor, not the sitting room. The parlor which she had stopped reserving for formal visitors somewhere in the past week. Without entirely deciding to, and she told him about Graves, and the co-management clause, and the amendment she had filed that morning. He listened the way he always listened to her completely, without trying to finish her sentences or redirect her toward his own conclusions. It was one of the things about him that had always undone her that quality of attention. William Bennett made you feel when he was listening to you like there was nowhere else in the world he needed to be. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You did all of that," he said, "since Tuesday." "I did all of that since Tuesday," she agreed. He looked at her, the expression she now had a word for. "You are remarkable, Lizzie." She did not correct the name this time. "I am practical," she said. "It amounts to the same thing sometimes." "No," he said. "It doesn't. Practical is what people call it when they don't want to say remarkable." He leaned forward slightly. "What do you need from me specifically? Tell me what I can actually do." She had thought about this. She had thought about it carefully, because she was not going to ask William for something she did not actually need, and she was not going to refuse something that would genuinely help because she was too proud to accept it. "Your Charleston contact," she said. "I need to know if there is a record of the legal mechanism he used in the second marriage, the deed transfer that excluded his wife. If he has used that same method more than once, that is a pattern, and a pattern is something the county court will find relevant." "I'll write today," he said, "and I need someone to witness the amendment filing at the court. Officially. A second-party signature is not required, but it adds weight, and She stopped, looked at him. "I would rather it be someone whose name carries standing in this county." "I'll go with you," he said immediately. No deliberation, no performance. Just the automatic certain answer of a man who had already decided. "William, when?" She looked at him for a moment. "Next Wednesday. The clerk needs 3 days to prepare the supporting documentation." "I'll be here at 8, he said. She nodded. She looked down at her hands in her lap for a moment, and then she looked back up at him, and she said something she had not planned to say. "I want to tell you something," she said, "and I need you to just hear it, not respond to it. Not yet." He waited. "I have been angry at you," she said. "For the 7 years. I told you that. But I have also been," she searched for the right word, "grateful. In a way I did not want to admit because admitting it felt like giving you something I wasn't ready to give. But you came here with that letter from Charleston, and you didn't pretend you hadn't written it, and you didn't apologize for something you weren't actually sorry for, and that was—" She paused. "That was very like you, the version of you I have always known, the best version." He was very still. "I am not saying I have decided anything," she said. "I am saying I see you. I am choosing to look at you directly instead of sideways. That is what I am able to give you right now, and I wanted you to know it." He said nothing for a long moment. "That is enough," he said finally. "That is more than enough." She nodded once. She straightened. I'll have Martha bring some coffee." "That'd be fine," he said. And then quietly in the voice that was not a ballroom voice, "Thank you, Lizzie." She did not correct the name. The week that followed moved in two directions simultaneously. On the surface, everything was ordinary. Whitmore continued to call. She continued to listen to his proposals with pleasant, non-committal attention. He was beginning to push slightly harder. She could feel it in the way his questions had started to contain embedded assumptions, small framings that presumed her agreement to things she had not agreed to. He was a skilled man. In a different life dealing with a different woman, it would have worked. Underneath the ordinary surface, everything was moving fast. William's second letter from Charleston arrived Thursday. His contact had found the legal filing from Whitmore's second marriage, the deed transfer document drafted by a Charleston attorney named Hedges. The language was specific. The method was specific. And it was word for word in 3 key clauses, identical to the language in the transport arrangement Whitmore had proposed to Elizabeth. She read that letter twice. She sat with it for a long time. He had not adjusted his method. He had not even changed the language, which meant either he was arrogant enough to believe no one would check, or he had used it so many times that it had become automatic, like a man who has told the same lie for so long that he no longer thinks of it as a lie. She thought it was probably both. She brought the letter to Graves. Graves read it and then set it down and looked at her with the expression of a man who had practiced law for 50 years and was no longer easily surprised, but was on this occasion mildly impressed. 3 identical clauses, he said. 3, she confirmed. "That is not coincidence," he said. "That is a practiced instrument." "Yes. If you bring this to the county court in conjunction with the amendment filing." "I intend to," she said, "but I need the amendment completed first. The sequence matters. I want the deed closed before he knows what I have." Graves nodded slowly. "Wednesday." "Wednesday," she said. Monday arrived, and with it something she had not planned for. Whitmore came without sending a note ahead. He appeared at her door at 10 in the morning, which was not a calling hour afternoon, was a calling hour. And when Martha came to find Elizabeth in the back of the house, her chin was at an angle that meant something was wrong. Elizabeth came to the front hall. He was standing just inside the door, and his smile was present but different. Something underneath it had shifted. The careful ease was still there, but beneath it was a tension she had not seen before, like a watch wound, one turn too many. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "I wasn't expecting you." "Forgive the informality," he said. "I had something I wanted to discuss, and I found I couldn't wait until Thursday." She studied him for a moment. Then she said, "The sitting room." She sat. He sat. He did not do the preliminary courtesies, the compliment about the house, the inquiry about her health. He went straight to it, which told her that something had changed in his timeline, and he was adjusting. "I'd like to move the transport arrangement forward," he said. "I have a business partner arriving from Philadelphia next week who is prepared to invest in the venture, but he needs the foundational agreements in place before he commits his capital. I realize this is faster than we discussed, but I want to assure you the terms remain exactly as I presented them." She looked at him. He was watching her with that practiced attention, reading her face for hesitation or compliance, and she understood with sudden clarity that this was the moment. This was the push. The partner from Philadelphia might be real, or might be an invention, but the pressure was real. The attempt to create urgency to compress her timeline, to move her from considering to signing, before she had the chance to do what she had already done. She kept her face entirely pleasant. "I appreciate your confidence in the arrangement," she said. "I want to be honest with you, Mr. Whitmore. I have been giving this serious consideration." He leaned forward very slightly. "I'm glad to hear it." "I have some questions about the deed amendment language," she said. "The clause in Section 4, the co-management structure. I've been reviewing it with some care." Something changed in his face. Almost nothing. A flicker quickly managed. "Of course," he said. "Any questions you have, I'm happy to address." "I've been comparing it to some other documents," she said, still pleasant, still easy. "Legal filings, mostly. It's a habit my father instilled in me. He always said the same language and two different agreements meant the same hand wrote both. The silence that followed was very brief, controlled, but she felt it. "That's a sound instinct," Whitmore said. He was a sound man. She looked at him steadily. "I'll need another week before I can give you an answer, Mr. Whitmore. I want to make sure I have understood everything properly." He looked at her for a moment that lasted slightly too long to be comfortable. "A week," he said. "A week," she agreed. He smiled, the practiced version fully restored. "Of course, Miss Carter. There's no rush." "There is every rush," she thought, "and you know that I know it." He left. She did not move for a full minute after the door closed. Then she stood, went to her father's study, sat down at his desk, and placed both hands flat on the surface of it. 2 days. She needed 2 more days to get to Wednesday, to get to the court, to close the clause, and put the pattern document into the judge's hands. 2 days of keeping Charles Whitmore uncertain enough not to act and confident enough not to run. 2 days of performing exactly the kind of calm she did not entirely feel. She thought about her father. She thought about the way he had sat at this desk for 30 years working through cases that seemed unwinnable and finding the place where the law and the facts aligned. And she thought about what he had told her when she was young and frightened about something she no longer remembered. He had said, "The situation is only impossible until you find the next right step. You don't have to find all the steps at once, just the next one." The next step was Wednesday. She picked up her pen. She had a letter to write to William. It said only, "Wednesday is more important than we thought. I will explain Tuesday evening. Don't be late." She sealed it and sent it. Then she opened the ledger and she went back to work. Because there was always work. And work was the thing that had carried her through every hard thing she had faced since the morning she had stood in this room and understood that her father was gone and the estate was hers and no one was coming to save her. No one had ever needed to. She had always known the next step. She just had to keep knowing it for 2 more days. Tuesday evening arrived, the way significant evenings always did, quietly without announcement, with no outward sign that anything about it was different from any other summer night in Richmond, Virginia. William came at 7. Elizabeth heard his horse on the drive, and she was already at the door before Martha could get there, which was not something she normally did, and which Martha noted with a look that communicated an entire editorial without a single word being spoken. Elizabeth ignored the look and opened the door, and William came in with his hat in his hand and took one look at her face and said, "Tell me." She told him. She told him about Whitmore's unannounced visit Monday morning. She told him about the Philadelphia partner, the compressed timeline, the pressure to sign before Wednesday. She told him about the moment when she had mentioned the identical legal language and watched something flicker behind Whitmore's careful smile. She told him all of it standing in the front hallway because she had been inside her own head with it for 36 hours, and she needed to say it out loud to someone who would understand exactly what it meant. William listened without moving. When she finished, he was quiet for 3 full seconds. Then he said, "He's running out of time." "Yes." Something changed. Not the Philadelphia partner, that's a device. Something else changed, and he needs the signature before it catches up with him. "That's what I think," she said. "I don't know what yet. My contact in Charleston sent a second letter this afternoon." He reached inside his coat and produced it. "I was going to wait until you'd finished, but read the last paragraph." She took the letter. She found the last paragraph. She read it twice. Charles Whitmore had not only been investigated informally by William's contact. He had been the subject of a formal complaint filed in Charleston civil court by his second wife's brother, a Mr. Thomas Elliott, who had retained an attorney and was pursuing recovery of the estate deed that had been transferred during the marriage. The case had been filed 6 weeks ago. If it proceeded, Whitmore's legal standing in any joint property arrangement would be scrutinized. Any agreements he had signed or was party to would be examined. He needed assets secured before the Charleston case generated correspondence that reached Virginia. He was not running out of patience. He was running from something that was already behind him. Elizabeth folded the letter. She was quiet for a moment. "He came here because he needed to move fast," she said. Not because I was a specific target. I was a convenient one. The water writes the clear deed a woman managing alone. He needed something clean that he could document and formalize before Charleston caught up. Yes, William said, and now he knows I've been looking at the language. She handed the letter back. He'll decide by tomorrow whether to run or push harder. Which do you think he'll do? She thought about it. She thought about the way Whitmore had sat in her sitting room and recalibrated in real time the way the smile had come back fully restored after that too long silence. She thought about a man who had done this twice before and walked away successfully. A man like that did not run from discomfort. He pushed until pushing stopped working. He'll push, she said. Then tomorrow I need to make sure he has no reason to think the push won't work, she said. Which means I need to see him tomorrow, before Wednesday. William looked at her. You want to invite him? I want to make him believe he is winning, she said. One more day. I need one more day of him believing that, and then Wednesday morning we go to the court. He held her gaze for a moment. That's a considerable thing to ask of yourself. I have been asking considerable things of myself for 6 years, she said. I reckon I can manage one more day. Something moved across his face. He didn't argue. He knew better than to argue with her when she used that voice, the quiet, absolute voice that meant the decision was already made and the conversation had moved to logistics. I'll be here at 8 Wednesday morning, he said. 7:30, she said. I want to be at the court when it opens. 7:30, he agreed. He stayed another hour. They sat in the parlor and they talked not about Whitmore, not about Wednesday, but about other things. About a book she had been reading. About a dispute his foreman had managed that week on the North Field. About a letter she had received from a cousin in Boston who had recently had her third child. Small things. Real things. The texture of ordinary life threaded through the extraordinary thing they were both sitting in the middle of. It was, Elizabeth thought, the most comfortable hour she had spent in weeks. At 9 o'clock, William stood to go. He picked up his hat. He turned to her in the doorway of the parlor, and he said in a voice that was careful and direct and entirely without performance, "Whatever happens Wednesday, you have already won this, Lizzie. You won it the moment you understood what he was doing and started documenting it. The court is just the formal part." She looked at him. "The formal part matters." "Yes," he said, "it does. But so does everything that came before it." He settled his hat. 7:30. 7:30, she said. She listened to him right away. Then she went to her father's study one more time, sat at the desk, and wrote a note to Charles Whitmore. Cordial, casual. I have been giving your proposal further thought and would welcome a brief conversation tomorrow afternoon if you are available. 3 o'clock, if it suits. She sealed it and set it out for the Morning Post. Then she went to bed, and for the first time in a week she slept. Whitmore arrived Wednesday at 3, which was tomorrow, now which was no longer the plan. Which was, she stopped herself from that line of thinking. He had replied to her note within 2 hours. Yes, of course, 3 o'clock. I look forward to it. The speed of his reply told her everything about his state of mind. He was eager. He believed the pressure had worked, except the morning had already happened. At 7:30, William had been on her doorstep with old Mr. Graves beside him, because Graves had insisted on being present, had said in his particular 81-year-old way that he had drafted the original filing and he would see it properly closed, and Elizabeth had not argued with him because he was right. They had ridden to the county courthouse together. The clerk, Mr. Fenwick, had processed the amendment filing with the meticulous care of a man who understood he was looking at something important. Graves had reviewed every word. William had signed as witness. Elizabeth had signed as owner. The co-management clause in the original 1778 deed was formally, legally, permanently closed. She had shaken Graves's hand on the courthouse steps and said, "Thank you." He had said, "Your father built a good thing. I'm glad it holds." And then he had gotten back into his carriage, and she had stood in the summer morning air and felt something unknot itself in her chest that she hadn't fully realized was knotted. William had stood beside her. He had not said anything. He had just been there, which was, she understood this now with a clarity she hadn't had before, what he had always done. He had always just been there. He had not always been brave enough to say what that meant, but he had been there steadily, reliably, in every way, except the one she had needed most. She was beginning to think the one she had needed most was no longer the only one that counted. Now it was 3 o'clock, and Whitmore was sitting across from her in the sitting room, and he had the look of a man who had finally arrived somewhere he had been working toward for a long time. "I've been thinking about your concerns regarding the deed language," he said. Warm, reasonable. The voice of a man who was confident he had answers. "I want to address them directly, because I think when you see the full picture, you'll find the structure is quite sound." "I'd like that," Elizabeth said. He laid out his case. It was a good case. She acknowledged that internally, even as she listened to it, with the composed attention of a woman who already knew where every piece of it pointed. He was articulate, and he was thorough, and he had clearly prepared for this conversation with care. He addressed the co-management clause language, specifically said, it was standard in commercial riparian agreements, said it offered her protection as well as him. Said it was the most common structure used in transport ventures along Virginia's river systems. She let him finish. She said, "You're quite right that it's a common structure." He smiled. The real version almost. Relief underneath it. "However," she said, "I filed a formal amendment to my original deed yesterday morning that closes the co-management clause in the 1778 grant. The amendment was witnessed and is now on record with the county court." The smile did not disappear all at once. It went slowly, the way a fire went when the fuel ran out, not extinguished, just reduced, and then reduced again, until what remained was only the shape of where the warmth had been. He looked at her. "I see," he said. Quiet. Controlled. "The clause was a vulnerability my father didn't have occasion to address during his lifetime," she said. "I should have addressed it sooner. I'm grateful the question of your proposal gave me reason to look at it carefully." A pause. He was working through something behind his eyes. She could see it, the rapid practiced calculation of a man assessing his options in real time. "That does complicate the structure," he said finally. "It does," she agreed. "It would need to be renegotiated." "Mr. Whitmore." She kept her voice even. Kind even. The tone her father had used when he was delivering a clear truth to someone who needed to hear it without the comfort of ambiguity. "I don't think we should negotiate further." Another pause. Longer this time. "Miss Carter, I also want you to know," she said, "that I have been in correspondence with a legal associate in Charleston regarding some filings in the civil court there. A Mr. Thomas Elliott. Are you familiar with him?" The silence that followed was the kind that had weight to it. He was very still. "I mention it," she continued, "not as a threat, as a courtesy, because I think a man of your intelligence understands that when multiple legal records point in the same direction, the direction becomes difficult to argue against." Whitmore looked at her for a long moment. She could see the calculation finishing. She could see the moment he arrived at his conclusion. "You've known for some time," he said. "Long enough," she said. He was quiet for another moment. Then something shifted in him, not a collapse, not the dramatic unraveling of a man caught in a lie, but something quieter and more honest than she had expected from him. He sat back. He looked at her with an expression that was for the first time in all their conversations close to real. "You are not what I expected," he said. "No," she said. "I reckon I'm not. I did my research." "I know, so did I." He picked up his hat from the table beside him. He stood. He was still a tall man, still well-dressed, still carrying himself with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to moving through rooms on his own terms. But something had gone out of it. Something that had been performed rather than earned. "I'll be leaving Richmond," he said. "I expect that would be wise," she said. He looked at her once more. a look she could not entirely categorize, somewhere between recognition and something that might, in a different life with different choices, have approached respect. Then he said, "Good afternoon, Miss Carter," and he walked out of her sitting room and out of her front door, and she heard his horse on the drive, and then nothing. Martha appeared in the doorway within 30 seconds, which meant she had been stationed in the hall. "Well," Martha said. "Well," Elizabeth agreed. "Gone. Gone." Martha's chin moved through several positions. Then she said, "I'll put the kettle on," in the tone of a woman who understood that some victories deserved to be marked with something warm. Elizabeth sat in the empty sitting room for a moment. She breathed. She felt the shape of the past 3 weeks, Whitmore's first visit, and the practiced smile and her father's book placed on her parlor shelf like a key to a lock he intended to pick. She felt the weight of it settling, and then lifting the way a carried thing lifted when you finally set it down. She had done it, not alone, but she had done it. She thought about that for a moment. The not alone part. 2 years ago, 3 years ago, she would have needed to do it alone. She would have insisted on it, because alone was safe, alone was controlled, alone was the arrangement she had made with herself after her father died. And she understood that depending on another person was a door that only opened in one direction. Something had shifted. She was not entirely sure when. She went to her father's study. She sat at his desk. She pulled out the household ledger, the real one, the one with 6 years of figures and notes in her careful hand, and she turned to a fresh page and she began to write a summary of what had happened with the deed amendment, the dates and the parties and the legal record, the way her father had always documented the resolution of any matter, thorough, clear, dated. She was halfway through it when she heard William arrive. She had not sent word. She had not needed to. He came at 4 o'clock, which was the time he had said he would come, and she heard his voice in the hall, and Martha saying something short and pointed, and then his footsteps, and then the study door. "It's done," she said without looking up from the ledger. She heard him exhale. Just once. The sound of a man who had been holding something carefully for a long time and was finally putting it down. "How did he take it?" William asked. "Better than I expected," she said. "Worse than he wanted to." She finished the entry. She closed the ledger. She looked up at him. "He's leaving Richmond." "Good." He said I wasn't what he expected. "No," William said with a certain quiet emphasis. "I reckon you're not what most people expect." He moved into the room. He sat down across the desk from her in the chair that visitors had always used, that old Mr. Graves had sat in yesterday. "Are you all right?" She considered the question. She considered it genuinely, which was something she did not always do when people asked it. "Yes," she said. "I think I am. I think I will be more all right tomorrow than I am today, and more the day after. But yes." He nodded. He was watching her with that expression, the one she had finally named, the one that had been there all along, underneath the friend and the neighbor, and the careful protector of everything except the one thing that mattered. "I owe you an apology," he said. She looked at him. "William?" "Not for writing to Charleston. I'm still not sorry for that." He met her eyes squarely. "For the 7 years. I have said it before, but I want to say it again clearly, without any qualification. I was a coward about something that mattered, and you carried the cost of that, and I am sorry." She held his gaze. "I know," she said quietly. "I believe you, but I also want to say something else." He leaned forward slightly. "What you did these past 3 weeks, what I watched you do, that was not something I helped you with. That was yours. The Graves meeting the amendment, understanding Whitmore's timeline before he understood that you understood it. That was you, Lizzie. I witnessed it. That's all I did." She looked at him for a long moment. "That mattered more than you know." "I hope it mattered," he said. I would like to keep mattering, in whatever way you'll allow." The room was very quiet. This was the moment she had been building toward for 3 weeks, or perhaps for 7 years, or perhaps for the entire length of her adult life. The moment when the question that had lived in the space between them finally had enough room to be asked plainly. She thought about the woman she had been in the Hartwell garden, standing with her back to him, saying, "I wish that were true," in a voice that wasn't meant for anyone, and landing in the one place she hadn't intended. She thought about the woman she was now sitting at her father's desk with a closed ledger and a formally amended deed and 3 weeks of handled difficulty behind her. Not the same woman, but not so different either. Still herself, only more fully herself, more willing to look at what she wanted directly instead of sideways. "I have a question for you," she said. "All right," he said. "If I had been a different kind of woman," she said. "If I had waited not 7 years but another 7, another 10, if I had kept the silence and never said what I said in that ballroom, would you have spoken first?" Eventually. He was quiet for a moment. She appreciated that he did not answer immediately. She appreciated that he took it seriously. "I don't know," he said finally. "I hope so. I want to tell you yes with certainty, but I don't know, and I think you deserve the honest answer more than you deserve the comfortable one." She looked at him. "That," she said, "is the most honest thing you have said to me in 7 years." He acknowledged that with a slight nod. "I know. I said what I said by accident," she told him. "I did not plan it, and I did not mean for you to hear it. But I'm glad you did. Even with everything that followed, even with all of it, I'm glad." "So am I," he said. "I am not ready," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I am not ready to simply step into something as though the 7 years did not happen. I need time to trust what I see. Not because I doubt you specifically, because I have learned the hard way these past weeks that I am a better judge of what I see when I have allowed myself to look long enough." "That seems right to me," he said. "And I will not be managed," she said. "Not by you, not by anyone. My estate, my decisions, my timeline, those are mine." "I wouldn't have it any other way," he said. The plainness of it. No performance, no ornament. Just a man saying a true thing in a room with someone he wanted to be honest with. She breathed. "Then I think," she said carefully, "that I would like to continue. Whatever this is. I would like to let it continue and see what it becomes." William looked at her. That expression, that particular expression that she now understood had been there all along from the very beginning, from the first winter, and she had seen it and catalogued it and filed it away under things she could not afford to examine. She was done filing things away. "I'd like that very much," he said. Martha appeared in the doorway at that precise moment with a tea tray, which Elizabeth suspected was not entirely coincidental. Martha set the tray on the side table with the precision of a woman who had decided this occasion warranted the good china, which it apparently did, and said, "I made the shortbread," and then departed without waiting for a response. William looked at the shortbread. "Martha makes shortbread for special occasions," Elizabeth said. "I know," he said. "She made it the day your father's will cleared the court and you kept the house." She looked at him. "You remember that." "I remember most things about you," he said simply. "That is perhaps the most honest thing I have not said." She picked up her cup. She held it. Outside the study window, the summer evening was coming in slow and golden, and the mockingbird in the old oak had started up again, and somewhere down the drive, the last of the day's heat was pulling at the grass, and Richmond was exactly what it always was, imperfect, familiar, full of people who had known each other too long and not well enough. She was sitting in her father's study with a man who had known her for 7 years and seen her more clearly in the past 3 weeks than in all the years before combined. She had closed a legal vulnerability that had sat open for 40 years. She had outmaneuvered a practiced and deliberate predator, using nothing but patience, documentation, and the habit of thinking 3 steps ahead that her father had instilled in her before she was old enough to know he was doing it. She thought exactly where she was supposed to be. "Tell me something," she said. "Anything," William said. "The night at the Hartwell ball, when you called me your wife." She looked at him over her cup. "Was it truly just to avoid Mrs. Alderton?" He was quiet for a moment. The mockingbird went on outside. "No," he said. "No, I told myself it was," he said. In the moment, I told myself it was a convenient solution to an uncomfortable situation. That was... He paused. That was easier than admitting that when I looked around that room for someone to reach for, there was only ever one person I was going to reach for. There has only ever been one person I was going to reach for. I just... He stopped. You were afraid, she said. I was afraid, he said. I am still afraid some. But I reckon being afraid of something and doing it anyway is the only kind of courage that actually exists. She thought about that. She thought about her father saying the situation is only impossible until you find the next right step. She thought about standing in a garden in the dark, with honeysuckle pressing in from all sides, pressing her knuckles to her mouth and deciding she would not fall apart over a man who had taken 7 years to hear her. She had not fallen apart. She had done better than that. She had done considerably better than that. You're right, she said. About the only kind of courage. He smiled. Not the social smile, not the easy public smile that Richmond knew and found charming. The other one. The small, private, slightly uncertain one that she had only ever seen in unguarded moments that she had filed away in the same category as things too dangerous to examine. She was done with that category entirely. Drink your coffee, she said, before Martha's shortbread goes cold. Yes, ma'am, he said. And just like that, in the way of things that have been waiting a long time to become simple, it was easy. Not resolved, not finished, not without the work that still lay ahead of them. But easy in the way that truth was always easy once you stopped spending energy to keep it contained. Easy in the way that two people who had known each other for 7 years could be once they stopped pretending that knowing was the same as not feeling. She reached for a piece of shortbread. He reached for one at the same moment, and their hands were close on the plate, and neither of them moved away, and neither of them made anything of it. And the evening came in through the window, golden and warm and smelling of summer grass and old books, and everything she had ever cared about keeping. She had kept it. That was not a small thing. That was not a small thing at all. The days that followed were not simple. Elizabeth had not expected them to be simple. She was a practical woman, and practical women did not expect that the resolution of one difficult thing made everything else suddenly easy. Life did not organize itself that way. What happened after Whitmore left Richmond and the deed amendment settled into the county record was not a clean beginning. It was a middle, the particular complicated middle of two people who had known each other for 7 years and were now attempting carefully to know each other differently. William came on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Not every Tuesday and Thursday, not with the rigid formality of a man executing a schedule, but often enough that Martha stopped announcing him with the same ceremony she reserved for formal visitors and started simply saying, "Mr. Bennett's here," in the tone she used for things that were now part of the household's ordinary rhythm. Elizabeth noticed this. She did not comment on it. She filed it in a new category, not the old one, not the too dangerous to examine file she had kept for 7 years, but a new one she was still in the process of building. A category that had room in it for things she wanted. They read together. They argued about books which they had always done, but the arguments felt different now, more honest, less careful around the edges. William had opinions he had apparently been moderating for years, and when he stopped moderating them, she found she liked the unmoderated versions considerably better. He was sharper than she had known, more willing to be wrong and say so, more willing to push back when he thought she was wrong, which he did twice in the first week and 4 times in the second, and she found to her surprise that she preferred being pushed back on to being deferred to. She told him that. He said, "I know. I've known that for years. I was just afraid you'd push back on me in return." She said, "I will absolutely push back on you in return." He said, "I know that too. I'm starting to think I've been afraid of all the wrong things." The county, meanwhile, had noticed that Charles Whitmore had departed Richmond with considerable speed and without the business venture he had apparently been pursuing. Richmond noticed things of this kind. It was a county of people who had known each other for generations and who treated new information about their neighbors with the diligence of professional archivists. Within a week of Whitmore's departure, Elizabeth had received 3 separate visits from women who wanted to discuss the matter in terms that were only barely veiled as social calls, and one very direct inquiry from old Judge Caldwell, who had handled her father's probate and who appeared at her door one morning with the specific look of a man who wanted facts rather than impressions. She told Judge Caldwell everything. She showed him the Charleston correspondence, the duplicate legal language, the amendment filing. She told him about Graves's analysis of the co-management clause. The judge listened with the focused attention of a man who had been reading legal documents for 40 years, and when she finished, he said, "Your father taught you well." And she said, "He taught me to read carefully and document everything." And the judge said, "That is the same thing." He left with copies of the relevant documents. He said he would be in correspondence with the Charleston court. He said she had done the county a service, and the way he said it was not the polite version of that phrase, but the real one. She stood on her front steps after his carriage had gone and felt something settle in her that had been unsettled for a long time. Not triumph. Something quieter and more substantial than triumph. The feeling of having done a right thing thoroughly and having it recognized as such. Martha appeared behind her. "Judge Caldwell never comes for social calls," she said. "No," Elizabeth agreed. "He doesn't." "Your father would have liked that," Martha said. "Yes," Elizabeth said. "He would have." She went back inside and wrote in the ledger, and did not allow herself to think about how much she wished her father could have seen it. She allowed herself to feel it instead, which was harder and also more honest, and also exactly what he would have wanted her to do. It was in the 3rd week on a Thursday afternoon that things shifted again. She had been expecting a comfortable visit. William had said he would come by to return the 2nd volume of a history she had lent him, and she had planned to show him the letter that had arrived from old Mr. Graves that morning. Graves had received a communication from the Charleston court confirming that the Elliott complaint against Whitmore was proceeding, and that the Virginia documentation Elizabeth had provided through Judge Caldwell had been formally entered into the record. It was good news, clean news, the kind of news she had earned, and she wanted to share it with the person who had helped her earn it. William arrived, and she told him about the letter, and he received it the way she expected, with satisfaction and without performance, the way a man received news that had always been going to be what it was. Then he sat down, and he did not pick up his coffee, and she looked at him and recognized immediately that he had come to say something. She waited. "My aunt came to see me yesterday," he said. "Mrs. Hargrove," Elizabeth said. Yes, Mrs. Caroline Hargrove was 64 years old, formidable, and had been the organizing intelligence behind more Richmond social arrangements than anyone had ever formally tallied. She was also, Elizabeth knew, the person William trusted most in his family, the person he had gone to when his mother died, the person who had told him the truth about his father's estate when no one else would, the person whose opinion he weighed when he weighed anyone's. She had things to say, Elizabeth guessed. She had a great many things to say, William said, about us, about what people are observing, about timing and propriety and the way Richmond notices things. He paused. She was not unkind, but she was direct. What did she say specifically? He met her eyes. She said that if my intentions were serious, I should act on them before the county made up its mind for me. She said that Richmond was already telling a story about us, and that stories told without the principal's participation rarely end the way the principals would choose. Elizabeth was quiet for a moment. "And what did you tell her?" "I told her my intentions were serious," he said, "and that the timeline was not mine to set." She looked at him. "You told her that?" "Yes." "How did she take it?" "She said..." He almost smiled. "She said that was either the most respectful thing she'd ever heard a Bennett man say, or the most cowardly, and she hadn't yet decided which." Elizabeth did laugh at that, short and real. "That sounds exactly like her." "It does." He was watching her. "But the underlying point is not nothing, Lizzie. She is right that Richmond is watching. She is right that stories form. And He stopped, started again. I find that I am less concerned with what Richmond thinks than I am with what you think. But I also know that you live here. You manage an estate here. Your reputation in this county has a practical weight that mine does not, because the world extends more grace to men in that particular respect, and I do not want what people say about us to create problems for you that you did not choose. She looked at him for a long moment. This was what she had not known how to name for 7 years. Not just the warmth, not just the attention, not just the showing up. This. The particular quality of his consideration, not the performance of consideration, not the social form of it, but the real thing. The thing that understood her situation and thought about her interests without being asked to, and brought it to her plainly instead of managing it on her behalf. "William," she said. "Yes. I am not concerned with what Richmond thinks either," she said. "I am aware of it the way I am aware of weather. I note it and account for it, and I don't let it decide for me." She paused. "But I appreciate that you brought it to me rather than deciding how to handle it yourself." "You told me in September that your decisions were yours," he said. "I have been trying to keep that in mind." "You have done well," she said. "Better than I expected, frankly." He looked mildly offended. "Better than you expected?" "You have a natural inclination to manage things," she said. "It is one of your better qualities, and also, occasionally, one of your more difficult ones. You have been managing it with some success. I'm acknowledging it." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You are possibly the only person in Virginia who says that kind of thing to my face. Martha says things like that to your face. Martha says them to everyone's face. It's different." He leaned forward slightly. "I want to ask you something." She waited. "Are you happy?" he said. "Not with me specifically. Not about Whitmore, or the deed, or any particular thing. Just are you happy? Right now in your life. In the shape of things." The question landed somewhere unexpected. She had not been asked that in a long time. People asked how she was managing. People asked if she was well. No one in the years since her father's death had asked if she was happy, and the difference between those questions was wider than it appeared. She thought about it honestly. "I am more content than I have been," she said slowly. "There are days that are hard in the way that days are hard when you carry things alone. And some things I am still carrying alone because I have not yet learned to put them down." She looked at him. "But I am, yes. I think I am happier than I was in July. I think I have been getting happier in a direction which is different from just being happy in a moment." He nodded slowly, like a man receiving something important and placing it carefully. "Good," he said. Quiet, final, like a door closed gently on exactly the right note. He picked up his coffee. They talked for another hour, and the afternoon went the way the best afternoons went, not dramatically, not memorably in any specific detail, but with the accumulated warmth of two people who were genuinely glad to be in the same room and no longer pretending otherwise. The twist came on a Saturday, and it came from a direction she had not anticipated. She received a letter, not from Charleston, not from Judge Caldwell. From a woman named Mrs. Dorothea Elliott of Charleston, South Carolina, the sister of Thomas Elliott, whose complaint against Whitmore was proceeding through the Charleston court. Mrs. Elliott wrote carefully with the restrained precision of a woman who had learned to be careful with her words after a great deal of experience with words being used against people she loved. She wrote to say that the Charleston court had requested documentation. She wrote to say that the Virginia materials, Elizabeth's deed amendment, the pattern evidence from the duplicate legal language, had been formally entered, and that they were, according to her brother's attorney, the strongest pieces of evidence in the case. She wrote to say that there was a second woman, a widow in Savannah, named Mrs. Frances Beaumont, who had suffered an identical arrangement to the one Whitmore's second wife had endured, and who had been unwilling to come forward until she learned that someone else had documentation. Mrs. Beaumont was now coming forward, because of what Elizabeth had done. Elizabeth sat with that letter for a long time. She had understood when she began documenting Whitmore's methods that she was protecting herself. She had understood in a more abstract way that what she was uncovering might be relevant to other cases. But the abstract understanding and the letter in her hand were two different things. The letter in her hand was a real woman in Savannah who had spent however many months or years carrying a thing in silence, the way Elizabeth had carried things in silence, and who had looked at what Elizabeth had built and found the courage to step forward. She was not going to cry about that. She cried a little about that. Martha found her at the kitchen table with the letter and did not say anything. Just put the kettle on and sat down across from her and was present in the quiet way of someone who had known a person since they were born and understood that some moments did not require words. "A woman in Savannah," Elizabeth said when she could say it. "From the letter?" Martha asked. "From the letter." Elizabeth looked at it. She was afraid to come forward alone. She wasn't alone. Martha said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Your father would say the best use of the law is not to punish wrongdoing after the fact. It is to make the wrongdoing impossible to repeat." "He did say that," Elizabeth said, "many times." "You made it impossible to repeat," Martha said. "At least once." Elizabeth folded the letter. She held it. "I did not plan for that." "No," Martha said. "The best things rarely are." She wrote back to Mrs. Elliot that same afternoon. She offered whatever additional documentation the Charleston court required. She offered if it would help a formal written account of her own experience with Whitmore and the methods he had used. She wrote it in her father's study at his desk, in the careful, clear hand that her father had taught her, and she felt him in every line of it, not as grief, not anymore, but as something steadier. The enduring presence of a man who had taught her to read carefully and document everything and trust that the law, when properly used, protected people who deserved protecting. She sealed the letter and felt for the first time in a very long time that she was entirely sure of herself. William came Thursday. She showed him the letter from Mrs. Elliot. He read it standing up, which he did when something was absorbing enough that he forgot to sit. And when he finished, he set it down and looked at her with an expression she did not have a category for because it was new. It was not the expression she had finally named. It was something that included that but was larger than it. Something like awe, except that was too large a word for his particular quiet way of showing it. "You did this," he said. "I protected my own property," she said. The rest followed. "Elizabeth." She looked at him. "You protected your property and built a legal record so thorough and clear that a woman in Savannah found her courage in it," he said. "That is not an accident. That is a particular kind of person doing a particular kind of work in the world." She held his gaze. She did not deflect. She had been deflecting compliments for 36 years out of the habit of not wanting to seem to need them, and she was done with that habit entirely. "Thank you," she said simply. He sat down. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I want to say something, and I need you to let me say it without interrupting." She raised an eyebrow. "Have I been known to interrupt? You have been known to reroute conversations when they get near something you'd rather not sit in," he said. "I'm asking you to sit in this one." She folded her hands in her lap. "All right." He looked at her steadily. "I have been thinking about what I want to say for 3 weeks. Not because I didn't know what it was. I knew what it was in the Hartwell garden in July. I have known for considerably longer than that, if I am being honest, and I am trying very hard to be honest with you because you have told me that honesty is what you need from me, and I believe you." He paused. "I am in love with you. I have been in love with you since the winter your father died. And you told me that grief does not follow a schedule, and I sat across from you in your front parlor and thought that is the person. That is the only person. And then I spent 7 years being afraid of it, and I am done being afraid of it, and I am asking you not for an answer today, not for a decision right now, because I understand you are not in the business of making decisions before you are ready, but I am asking you to know it, clearly, without qualification." He did not look away. "I love you, Elizabeth Carter. That is what I came to say." The room was very quiet. She looked at this man she had known in grief, and in laughter, and in stubbornness, and in the particular way he went still when he was thinking hard. She looked at him and felt all 7 years of it, the managing and the containing, and the careful, sideways looking, and she felt it not as something that had been lost, but as something that had made her into the kind of person who could sit in this room with the Carter ledger on the shelf behind her, and the Elliot letter on the desk in front of her, and know exactly who she was. "I know," she said. He blinked. "You know." "I have known for some time," she said. "Knowing and being ready to receive it are different things. I was not ready in July. I was not ready in August." She looked at him. "I am ready now." He was very still. "I love you too," she said. Plain, clear. The way her father had said important things without ornament, because the thing itself was ornament enough. "I have loved you for a very long time, William. Long enough that I cannot tell you exactly when it started, because it started before I knew to mark it. I loved you through 7 years of not saying it, and I love you now, and I intend, if you are willing to be patient with me, and I believe you are, I intend to love you considerably better going forward than I was able to do while I was spending all my energy pretending not to." He exhaled. The sound of a man who had been carrying something for 7 years and had just finally put it down. "I am willing to be patient," he said. His voice was rough at the edges in the way it got when he was genuinely moved and not performing anything. "I am willing to be whatever you need me to be." "I need you to be honest with me," she said. "Even when it's inconvenient, especially then." "Yes, and I need you to understand that this estate and its management are mine," she said. "A partnership in any form does not change that. I will hear your thoughts. I will consider them. The decisions remain mine." "I would not have it any other way," he said. "I have watched you run this estate for 6 years, Lizzie. I have watched you read legal documents and manage creditors and outmaneuver a practiced con man from Charleston. I have approximately 0 interest in interfering with any of that." She almost smiled. "Approximately 0. There might be 1% of me that occasionally wants to fix things before you've asked me to fix them," he said. "I am working on that 1%. "I know," she said. "I've noticed." They looked at each other. It was the look of two people who had finally stopped pretending, which was different from the look of two people who had just met, because it had history in it. Every argument and every silence and every careful courtesy, and every moment of unguarded honesty threaded through it like wire through fabric. Not simple, not uncomplicated, but real, fully real, in the way that only things earned over time could be. "I should like to call on you formally," William said. "With your permission. I should like to do this, whatever this is, in the right way." "You have been calling on me for 7 years, she said. "Not like this." "No," she agreed. "Not like this." She paused. She looked at him for a moment with the clear, direct gaze she had been practicing, the one she had been too afraid to use for 7 years, because looking at him directly was too much like admitting everything. "Yes," she said. "You may call on me formally, William Bennett." Something broke open in his face, not dramatically, just openly, like a window after a long winter. The autumn came in quietly the way Virginia autumns did, trading the summer's heaviness for something cooler and clearer. The heat broke in late September, and the countryside around Richmond went the colors it went every year, the golds and the deep reds, and the particular amber of the old oaks that Elizabeth had grown up knowing, and she found that she was moving through her days differently. Not lighter exactly, solider, more grounded somehow in what was real and what was hers. William called on her formally, and Richmond noticed, and Richmond talked about it the way Richmond talked about everything, with enthusiasm and a liberal application of opinion, and she let them talk because she had learned a long time ago that you could not stop a county from forming views about you, and the only thing you could control was whether those views bothered you. They did not bother her. Mrs. Hartwell came to call in early October and sat in the front parlor with the satisfied expression of a woman who had been expecting this outcome for some time. "I told you," she said before Elizabeth had even poured the tea. "At the midsummer ball, I told you he was looking for you." "You told me he'd looked 3 times," Elizabeth said. "Same thing. Mrs. Hartwell said serenely. Elizabeth poured the tea. Mrs. Hargrove came on a separate occasion, which Elizabeth suspected had been timed deliberately to avoid overlapping with Mrs. Hartwell, who she knew Mrs. Hargrove found exhausting. William's aunt was brisk and sharp-eyed, and said within 5 minutes of sitting down, "I understand my nephew has formally declared his intentions." "He has," Elizabeth said. "And you?" "I have received them," Elizabeth said. Mrs. Hargrove looked at her. It was a long, assessing look of the kind that could have felt uncomfortable, and somehow didn't. "Your father was a good man," she said finally. "Principled, clear-headed, not susceptible to flattery." She paused. "You are your father's daughter." It was coming from Caroline Hargrove, something close to a benediction. "Thank you," Elizabeth said. Old Mr. Graves sent a note in November. He did not travel well in the cooler months that said, only, "I have been informed that certain personal matters are progressing alongside the legal ones. Your father would be pleased on both counts. The deed is solid, so I am given to understand is the gentleman. Yours, E. Graves." She kept that note in her father's desk. The courthouse letter came 3 weeks later, not from Virginia, from Charleston. It arrived on a Tuesday morning addressed to Miss Elizabeth Carter in a formal hand she did not recognize. It was from the presiding clerk of the Charleston Civil Court. It stated that the complaint of Thomas Elliot against Charles Whitmore had been resolved in Mr. Elliot's favor. The estate deed wrongfully transferred during the marriage of Whitmore and his second wife had been legally restored. The court wished to acknowledge the material contribution of the Virginia documentation to the outcome of the case. The presiding judge, the letter concluded, had taken the liberty of noting for the formal record the name of the party whose preparation and foresight had made the case documentable. The name on record was Miss Elizabeth Carter of Richmond, Virginia. She read the letter twice. She set it on her father's desk. She sat for a moment in the quiet of the study, with the morning coming through the window and the ledger on the shelf, and 30 years of her father's books arranged exactly as he had arranged them. She said nothing out loud, but she thought, "I did that. I built something that held. I protected what was mine, and in doing so, I gave someone else back what was theirs, and the record says so, and the record will say so long after this morning is gone. That was not a small life. That was not a small life at all." William came that afternoon, and she handed him the letter without preamble. He read it. He set it down. He looked at her across her father's desk, and there was nothing performed in his expression, and nothing held back. "Well," he said. "Well," she said. "Your father's name should be on that letter too," he said. "Everything you used he taught you." "He taught me the tools," she said. "I built the house." "Yes," William said. "You did." He reached across the desk. He placed his hand over hers, not as a gesture, not with any particular drama, just the steady, certain warmth of a man who had decided where he was and intended to stay there. She turned her hand and held his. They stayed like that for a moment. Outside, the November air was cool, and the old oak had dropped most of its leaves, and Richmond was exactly what it had always been. Inside the study, two people who had known each other for 7 years held hands across a desk where a letter from a Charleston court sat next to a household ledger 6 years in her hand, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing that needed saying that was not already present in the room. The proposal came in December, which surprised her because she had not expected him to move quickly once she had told him he could move at all. She had assumed correctly, she thought, that William Bennett was a man who had learned from his errors and would proceed with appropriate caution. What she had not fully accounted for was that William Bennett was also a man who had spent 7 years being too cautious and had recently, with considerable effort and some genuine courage, decided to stop. He did not do it in the parlor. He did not do it at the Hartwell estate or the Holloway house or any of Richmond's assembled social venues. He came to the house on a Thursday afternoon in December with the winter light coming pale through the study window, and found her exactly where she usually was, at her father's desk, with the ledger working. He sat down in the chair across from her. He said, I have a question for you." She put her pen down. He looked at her, clear-eyed, direct, exactly the way she had asked him to be. "Elizabeth Carter," he said, "I have known you for 7 years. I have been in love with you for nearly all of that time. I have handled it badly for most of it, and I have been handling it better for the past 5 months. And I intend to keep handling it better for as long as you will allow me to." He paused. "I am asking you to marry me, not as a joke in a ballroom, not as a convenient solution to an uncomfortable situation, as the truest and most deliberate thing I have ever said in my life." She looked at him. She thought about the Hartwell ballroom in July, the candlelight and the crowded floor, and the 3 words she had said to no one and everything. She thought about 7 years of sideways looking and careful management, and the particular exhaustion of carrying something alone because you were not sure it was safe to put it down. She thought about standing in the garden in the dark and walking away, and deciding she would not fall apart over a man who had taken 7 years to hear her. She had not fallen apart. She had done the opposite of falling apart. She had built something closed, something opened, something held something up to the clear light of legal record and watched it hold. She had done it while keeping her own name and her own desk and her own decisions exactly where they belonged. She was ready. She looked across the desk at William Bennett, who had chosen her name in a ballroom without knowing he was choosing it, who had come into a garden after a woman who was trying not to need him, who had written to Charleston and witnessed a deed filing, and sat with her through the best hours and the hardest ones, and said the true thing plainly when it mattered. "Yes," she said, not a whisper. Not the small, private, barely audible yes of a woman who was not sure she was allowed to mean it. A clear, certain, unambiguous yes, spoken in her father's study, at her own desk, in her own voice. "Yes," she said again, because it was worth saying twice. He smiled, the private one, the real one, the one she had been cataloging for 7 years and was finally allowed to simply look at, and she smiled back, and the winter light came through the window and fell on the ledger and the letter from Charleston and the 30 years of books arranged exactly as her father had arranged them. They were married in the spring of 1818 on a Saturday in May, when the Virginia countryside was green and the old oak by the Carter fence had come back into full leaf. It was a modest ceremony by Richmond standards, which meant it was attended by approximately every person who had any connection to either family, and several who did not. Mrs. Hartwell cried, which surprised no one. Mrs. Hargrove did not cry, which surprised no one either, but she gripped Elizabeth's hand before the ceremony with a firmness that communicated everything her composure would not allow her face to show. Old Mr. Graves was there, brought in a carriage with 2 cushions and considerable care, and he watched the whole proceeding with the expression of a man who had filed the original deed and the amendment, and understood that he was witnessing the final document in a long and well-constructed case. Martha stood in the back and said nothing to anyone and looked entirely satisfied. At the reception held in the Carter Garden, because Elizabeth had chosen her own garden over any of the county's grander venues, without a moment's hesitation, a man named Mr. Holloway, who had been drinking the excellent punch for some time, raised his glass and said, "Do you remember, Bennett, when you called her your wife as a joke at the Hartwell ball, you nearly caused a scandal?" The room went quiet in that particular way rooms did when something was about to be either very funny or very true. William held Elizabeth's hand. He looked at her. She looked at him. There was a whole conversation in it, 7 years and 3 words in a ballroom and a garden in the dark, and a letter from Charleston and a yes spoken twice in a study that smelled of old books and everything she had ever cared about keeping. He turned to Mr. Holloway. "The joke," he said, "was pretending I didn't mean it." The room laughed. The good kind of laughter, warm and real, and full of people who were glad to be in the same place at the same time. Elizabeth squeezed his hand, and he squeezed back, and the spring afternoon went on around them green and unhurried and full. She had not been looking for rescue. She had not needed it. She had needed a man who understood that a man brave enough finally to choose her without being asked twice, and honest enough to say so plainly and steady enough to stay. She had found him. Or rather, she had known him all along, and she had been patient enough and strong enough and clear-eyed enough to wait until he found himself. That was the story. That was all of it. Not a woman who was saved. A woman who built what she needed and chose what she wanted and carried her father's name and her own name forward into a life that was fully, completely, unreservedly hers. That was enough. That was everything.